Welcome to today's story of love, life, and betrayal. For more free stories and entertainment from our channel, please hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe with notifications. Now, let's dive into The Mother of All Betrayals, a story that proves sometimes the people who marry into your family are exactly the ones you should be most careful about. Sophie Harris sat in her cozy living room, staring at the stack of documents spread across her coffee table, trying to understand how her son-in-law had managed to convince her to hand over the deed to her late husband's vintage car collection worth $75,000. The papers told a story of fraudulent restoration projects, fake auction opportunities, and forged appraisals that had systematically transferred ownership of her precious classic cars over the past 18 months. At 68, Sophie had thought she was too smart to fall for elaborate schemes. She'd spent 40 years as a librarian, the last 15 as head librarian at the city's main branch, and she prided herself on her ability to research, verify information, and spot inconsistencies in any story. But Marcus Wellington had been very good at his job. Marcus had swept into their family 3 years ago like a charming whirlwind, courting Sophie's daughter Emma with expensive dinners, weekend getaways, and romantic gestures that seemed too good to be true. Emma, a sweet but somewhat naive kindergarten teacher, had been completely smitten with the handsome classic car restoration expert who claimed to run his own high-end restoration business. Sophie had been initially skeptical. Marcus seemed almost too perfect, with his extensive knowledge of vintage automobiles, his connections to exclusive car auctions, and his smooth explanations of the classic car market. But Emma had been so happy, and Marcus had shown such genuine interest in Sophie's late husband's collection that she'd gradually let her guard down. The collection had been Harold's pride and joy. 12 beautiful classic cars from the 1950s and 1960s that he'd lovingly restored in their garage over 30 years of marriage. After Harold's death 5 years ago, Sophie had kept the cars in a climate-controlled storage facility, unsure what to do with them, but unable to bear the thought of selling her husband's legacy. Marcus had seemed like a godsend when he'd offered to help Sophie properly maintain and potentially increase the value of the collection. "Sophie, these cars are absolutely incredible," Marcus had told her during one of their weekly family dinners. "Harold had exquisite taste, and some of these models are becoming extremely valuable, but they need proper maintenance and restoration to reach their full potential." Marcus had presented her with detailed appraisals, market analysis reports, and connections to exclusive classic car auctions, where her vehicles could supposedly fetch premium prices. Everything had looked legitimate, and Sophie had been impressed by Marcus's apparent expertise in the vintage automobile world. Over the next year and a half, Sophie had gradually allowed Marcus to take various cars for restoration work and auction preparation. Each car had come with professional-looking documentation, regular progress reports, and Marcus's enthusiastic assurances that Sophie's collection was being preserved and enhanced by expert craftsmen. He'd even shown her before and after photos and detailed restoration invoices that appeared to prove the cars were receiving top-quality care and increasing in value. But last week, Sophie had wanted to visit the cars and check on their condition, and that's when Marcus's elaborate house of cards had begun to collapse. "There's a temporary storage issue," Marcus had explained when Sophie asked about seeing her collection. "The restoration shop is moving to a new facility, and the cars are in transit between locations. Just give it another few weeks." Sophie's librarian instincts had immediately gone on high alert. She'd spent decades helping people research complex topics, and she knew how to verify information independently. So she'd started doing her own investigation into Marcus's restoration work and auction connections. What she'd discovered was devastating. The restoration shop Marcus claimed to be using didn't exist. The address he'd provided was a vacant warehouse that had been empty for over 2 years. The auction house he'd mentioned was a legitimate business, but they had no record of any cars being consigned by Marcus or anyone associated with him. The expert appraisers whose reports Marcus had shown her were fictional people with fake credentials. Every single car in Sophie's collection was missing. Sophie had spent the past week documenting the full extent of the fraud, and the picture that emerged was of a systematic, sophisticated theft operation that had been specifically designed to target her late husband's prized automobile collection. Marcus Wellington wasn't even his real name. According to Sophie's research, he was actually Martin Webb, a serial car thief with a history of targeting widows' classic car collections through romantic relationships with their daughters or granddaughters. He'd been running the same scam in different cities for over a decade, marrying into families and then systematically stealing valuable vintage automobiles through fake restoration schemes. The worst part was that Emma had no idea what her husband had been doing. She genuinely believed that Marcus was a successful businessman who was helping her mother grow her retirement savings. Marcus had been careful to keep Emma out of the financial discussions, claiming he wanted to protect her from boring investment details. Now, Sophie faced an impossible choice: expose Marcus and destroy her daughter's marriage, or find another way to get justice for his theft of her life savings. But Sophie Harris hadn't become head librarian by backing down from difficult research projects, and she wasn't about to let a con artist destroy her family and steal her future. If Marcus wanted to play games with a retired librarian, he was about to discover that librarians had access to more information than he'd ever imagined. Sophie's investigation into Marcus's background had revealed far more than just his fake investments. She'd discovered a pattern of behavior that went back over 15 years, involving at least 7 different identities and dozens of victims across multiple states. Martin Webb, aka Marcus Wellington, had perfected the art of targeting middle-class families with older relatives who had valuable classic car collections. His method was always the same: charm a younger woman from a close-knit family, gain the trust of the older generation through shared automotive interests, and then systematically steal their vintage vehicles through fake restoration and auction schemes. But Marcus had made several crucial mistakes in choosing Sophie as his target. First, he'd underestimated her research skills. Sophie had spent 4 decades helping people find information, verify sources, and trace connections between seemingly unrelated facts. She knew how to use public records, professional databases, and social media to build comprehensive profiles of people and organizations. Second, he'd assumed that a retired librarian would be technologically naive. In reality, Sophie had been responsible for modernizing her library's digital systems and had excellent computer skills. Third, and most importantly, he'd failed to realize that librarians have extensive professional networks and know how to collaborate on complex research projects. Sophie had reached out to librarian colleagues across the country, asking them to help research Marcus's previous identities and scams. Within a week, she had a comprehensive dossier that documented his entire criminal career, complete with photographs, addresses, aliases, and victim testimonies. But Sophie's masterstroke was discovering that Marcus was currently running the same scam on at least 3 other families in their city. Through vehicle registration records and classic car club memberships, Sophie had identified 2 other women who had recently transferred ownership of valuable vintage automobiles to the same fake restoration companies that Marcus had used to steal her collection. Both women were in their 70s, both had daughters or granddaughters who had married charming men with automotive expertise within the past few years, and both were probably unaware that their prized car collections had been systematically stolen. Sophie realized that she had an opportunity not just to get revenge on Marcus, but to save other families from losing their automotive treasures. Her plan was elegant in its simplicity. She would give Marcus exactly what he thought he wanted, while documenting everything for law enforcement and ensuring that he walked directly into a trap of his own making. Sophie called Marcus and told him she'd found some additional cars that she wanted him to evaluate. "I've been going through Harold's garage records," she explained, "and I found documentation for 2 more cars that he'd stored off-site. A 1967 Mustang Fastback and a 1963 Corvette split window. They're in remarkable condition, and I'd like you to assess their value and potential for the auction market." Marcus was immediately interested. "That's fantastic, Sophie. Those are both extremely desirable models. Actually, the timing couldn't be better. I have connections with Barrett-Jackson Auction House, and they're always looking for premium vehicles for their upcoming auction." "Wonderful," Sophie said. "But Marcus, I want to make sure I understand exactly how this works. Could you put together a comprehensive presentation for me? I'd like to see all the details about the restoration process, the auction preparation, and the projected values." Marcus agreed enthusiastically, probably thinking that Sophie was becoming an even easier target. What Marcus didn't know was that Sophie had already contacted the FBI's auto theft division and was working with them to document his fraud. The agents were very interested in Marcus's operation, especially when Sophie provided them with evidence of his multiple identities and the pattern of targeting classic car collections through family relationships. "Mrs. Harris, what you've uncovered is exactly the kind of comprehensive evidence we need to build a federal case," Agent Sarah Chen had told her. "Auto theft rings like this often cross state lines, which makes it a federal crime. If you're willing to cooperate, we can set up a controlled operation that will allow us to gather evidence while protecting you and recovering the stolen vehicles." Sophie was more than willing to cooperate. The FBI had provided Sophie with recording equipment and had coached her on how to get Marcus to incriminate himself during their conversations. They'd also arranged for surveillance of Marcus's activities and had begun investigating his financial records. But Sophie had her own additional plans for revenge that went beyond just law enforcement. She'd been in contact with the other potential victims in the city, warning them about Marcus's scam and helping them document their own losses. She'd also reached out to victims from Marcus's previous scams in other states, building a network of people who wanted to see him brought to justice. Most importantly, Sophie had been carefully planning how to reveal the truth to Emma in a way that would minimize her daughter's emotional trauma while ensuring that Marcus couldn't manipulate or threaten her. The confrontation came on a Sunday evening during their weekly family dinner. Marcus arrived at Sophie's house carrying a leather portfolio filled with impressive-looking documents about classic car restoration and auction opportunities. He'd clearly spent considerable time preparing materials that looked professional and legitimate, including fake Barrett-Jackson auction catalogs and forged authentication certificates. "Sophie, I think you're going to be very excited about these opportunities," Marcus said, spreading out photographs and valuation reports on the dining room table. "These additional cars you've found are absolutely incredible finds. The '67 Mustang Fastback alone could be worth $150,000 after proper restoration, and the split-window Corvette could easily bring $200,000 at the right auction." Sophie nodded and asked detailed questions about the restoration process, the authentication procedures, and the auction timeline. Marcus had smooth answers for every question, complete with fabricated details about meetings with Barrett-Jackson representatives and negotiations with master craftsmen who specialized in these particular models. Emma watched the presentation with obvious pride in her husband's business acumen, occasionally asking innocent questions that Marcus answered with the patient confidence of someone who believed he was completely in control of the situation. "This all sounds wonderful," Sophie said when Marcus finished his presentation. "I'm definitely interested in investing. But before I write a check, I have a few more questions." "Of course," Marcus replied. "I want you to feel completely comfortable with this decision." "Well," Sophie said, "I've been doing some research on my own, and I found some things that confused me." Marcus's confident expression flickered slightly. "What kind of things?" Sophie pulled out her own folder, which was considerably thicker than Marcus's portfolio. "For example, I tried to verify the Barrett-Jackson connection, and they have no record of working with you. I looked up the master craftsman you mentioned, and they don't exist. I searched for the restoration shop you've been using, and the address is a vacant warehouse." Marcus started to respond, but Sophie continued. "I also did some research on you, Marcus, or should I say Martin?" The color drained from Marcus's face. Martin Webb, born in Cleveland, Ohio. Previously known as Michael Watson in Phoenix, Mark Wilson in Seattle, and Matthew Ward in Denver. Currently wanted by the FBI for auto theft, fraud, and identity theft. Emma looked confused. "Sophie, what are you talking about? Marcus, what is she saying?" Sophie turned to her daughter with a gentle expression. "Emma, sweetheart, I'm so sorry, but Marcus isn't who he says he is. He's a professional car thief who has been stealing Dad's classic car collection, and he's probably been planning to steal from other families too." Marcus stood up abruptly. "This is ridiculous, Sophie. I don't know what you think you've discovered, but I've discovered that every restoration project you recommended was fake," Sophie interrupted. "I've discovered that you've stolen 12 classic cars worth $75,000 from me over the past 18 months. And I've discovered that you've been running the same scam on other families in this city." Sophie pulled out photographs of Marcus's previous victims, copies of court documents from his earlier convictions, and vehicle registration records showing the movement of stolen cars through various fake businesses. "I've also discovered that you're married to at least 2 other women in other states, which makes your marriage to Emma invalid." Emma gasped and stared at her husband. "Marcus, tell me this isn't true." Marcus looked around the room like a trapped animal, clearly calculating whether he could talk his way out of the situation or whether he needed to run. He chose to run. Marcus grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, but he found his path blocked by FBI agent Sarah Chen and 2 other federal agents who had been waiting outside. "Martin Webb, you're under arrest for wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, and identity theft," Agent Chen announced as she handcuffed a stunned Marcus. As the agents read Marcus his rights and escorted him to their car, Sophie put her arm around Emma, who was crying and trying to process the fact that her entire marriage had been a lie. "Mom, how did you know?" Emma asked through her tears. "Honey, I spent 40 years helping people find information and verify facts. When something doesn't add up, I know how to investigate." "But how did you get the FBI involved?" Sophie smiled. "Librarians have excellent professional networks, including several who work in law enforcement. When I explained what I'd discovered, they were very interested in Marcus's operation. The aftermath of Marcus's arrest was swift and comprehensive. The FBI's investigation revealed that he'd stolen over $2 million from elderly victims across 6 states over the past decade. The evidence Sophie had gathered was instrumental in building the federal case against him. Marcus was eventually sentenced to 15 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution to his victims. The investigation also led to the recovery of some of the stolen funds, including about half of Sophie's retirement savings. But perhaps more importantly, Sophie's research and collaboration with law enforcement had prevented Marcus from victimizing other families and had helped bring closure to victims from his previous auto theft schemes. Emma's recovery from the emotional trauma was more gradual, but she eventually realized that her mother's actions had saved her from years of manipulation and potential financial abuse. "I can't believe I was so blind," Emma told Sophie 6 months after Marcus's arrest. "Looking back, there were so many red flags that I ignored." "He was very good at what he did," Sophie replied. "He spent years perfecting his techniques for gaining people's trust and exploiting their emotional attachments to family heirlooms." "How did you stay so calm during the investigation? I would have been terrified." Sophie smiled. "Honey, I've spent my entire career dealing with people who thought they could fool a librarian. Marcus was just another patron who thought he was smarter than the person behind the reference desk." A year after Marcus's arrest, Sophie had not only recovered her husband's car collection, but had become something of a local celebrity for her role in exposing the auto theft ring. She'd been interviewed by classic car magazines, had spoken at vintage automobile clubs about fraud prevention, and had even consulted with law enforcement on other similar cases. Sophie had also used her experience to help other families who had been targeted by automotive fraud, providing them with research techniques and emotional support as they worked to recover their stolen vehicles. "The key," Sophie would tell people, "is to remember that if something seems too good to be true, it probably is. And if someone discourages you from doing your own research or getting second opinions, that's a huge red flag." Emma had started dating again, this time with a much more careful approach to evaluating potential partners. She'd also developed her own research skills and had become an advocate for financial literacy education. "I never want to be that naive again," Emma told her mother. "I'm going to verify everything and trust but verify, just like you taught me." Sophie kept a framed photograph on her desk, not of Marcus's arrest, but of her and Emma at a financial literacy workshop they'd attended together. It reminded her that sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying your enemy, but using the experience to become stronger and help other people avoid the same mistakes. Marcus thought he was targeting a helpless old lady, Sophie reflected during one of her community presentations. But he forgot that librarians are professional researchers who know how to find information, verify sources, and work with experts to solve complex problems. "The best part," she would add with a smile, "is that everything I used to catch him came from public records and databases that anyone can access. He was brought down by the same research skills I used to help high school students write term papers." Sophie had learned that revenge didn't have to be about destroying someone. It could be about using your skills and resources to ensure that justice was served and that other people were protected from similar harm. Marcus Webb was now serving his 15-year sentence and would likely spend the rest of his life dealing with the consequences of underestimating a retired librarian who knew how to do her homework. And Sophie Harris had discovered that retirement could be just as intellectually challenging and socially meaningful as her professional career had been, especially when it involved protecting her family and her community from people who thought they were too smart to get caught. The moral of the story, Sophie liked to say, was simple: never try to con a librarian. They have access to all the information in the world. They know how to use it, and they're not afraid to collaborate with experts who can help them solve any problem. Thanks for listening to today's story of love, life, and betrayal. For more free stories and entertainment from our channel, please hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe with notifications.